I'm going to introduce Jan to you. Jan Stannard from Heal Rewilding is a very inspiring person. I got excited by the work she's doing purely by Googling rewilding. But then I got so interested that Alan and I went and visited the Somerset site, which is the first site that they have started. And I was so impressed by a young, talented, enthusiastic team that I just really decided this was the most amazing organization. They've got a big site, and Jan will be telling you all about it. She is dedicated to wild things and places and to the things that they can teach us. So with that, I would like to introduce Jan.
Thank you so much, Jane. Yes, it's an absolute privilege to be in this place. Oh, thank you, Eddie, for your applause. I shall share my screen. So I've got some slides and I'll talk to you a bit about the subject and a bit about the site. So right, can you see our beautiful marmalade hoverfly?
Yes, we can.
Look at that, isn't that beautiful? And yes, insects are very much where this work begins. The soil and the insects is where this work begins. So it's wonderful to be able to speak to you who are on this call tonight and anyone who watches this call subsequently. So I'm going to essentially just go through the subject and really focus on some of the things that you can do to, like us, make a direct difference to the state of nature, because these are the facts. Nature is not in a good place. There is a global ranking of countries and territories, of which there are 240, and England is in 234th place for the state of its nature, where first is the best. So we are amongst the least good in the world. And that's one of the things that got me started, got me interested. I've loved nature all my life, but seeing this absolute drumbeat of decline was so upsetting. And as I came to the end of my business life, I thought, how can I make a difference? And the rest, as they say, is history. About 3 years ago, same as you said, Jane, for Speak Up for Our Planet. So habitats, these numbers, I guess, may be familiar to many of you, but we've drained our land for good reason, to farm. Same reason that we've lost our wildflower meadows and that we don't have anything like the tree cover that we once did. And I'll mention something about the Heal Somerset site that's kind of poignant when it comes to thinking about these loss of these woodlands. So we got problems, and here's the state of nature's decline. So this clearly needs addressing, and wonderful people have done amazing conservation work for decades, since the 40s and 50s particularly. Keep what we still have in nature reserves and focus on preserving rare species, SSSI, special habitats. But the overall decline of wildlife has continued apace. And it's the arrival of this concept, which was actually a 1990s concept in America, came over to Europe and to the UK. And as people have begun to understand rewilding and how it can directly address nature loss, there's been huge excitement around it. And I first discovered it, as many people did, when I read Feral by George Monbiot, because that book in 2014, 15, something like that, describes rewilding as an approach to helping nature to recover, and is very clear about the shifting baseline syndrome. So you go out, our children go out, look in the countryside, and they don't see absence because they're not used to seeing it, and that's a problem. And so rewilding has made a huge difference. And what's really important, and this ties into Heal as a charity, which I'll talk about a bit later, but what needs to happen is nature needs more space, not just to exist in the small fragments that is left for it. And by needing more space, it's at every scale. So it's from gardens and public parks right up to estates of tens of thousands of acres. And at every scale, we can make a difference. So if you're watching this and you think, I can't make a difference because my space is small or I don't have one, if you live near a park and you're bold enough to go and talk to your council, you can make a difference. So this is what's key. And there is a government initiative to increase the amount of space for nature by 30% by 2030. And this isn't on highly productive agricultural land, because we still need to eat, but it's in the more marginal areas. And that can either be a dedicated space where all of the land is given over to nature, or in unproductive parts of farms or golf courses, or surface mines or reservoirs and so on. So all of those places which will quite likely have been mown, for example, you see that. I drive and see places where the area around a reservoir, say, has been mown, and you think, why would you do that? It doesn't make any sense. And people just don't understand what nature needs to thrive, and more space is one of them. So what's the difference between conservation and rewilding? And this is a philosophical difference, and it's how do we as humans regard what's happening? So conservation is an anthropocentric approach. It puts humans at the center of the change, in the sense that we both understand nature, know what it needs, and take the actions to shape the land. So that could be tree planting, hedge laying, coppicing, managing environments for a reason. So we as humans will decide on what the reason is, and then we will manage the habitat accordingly. Rewilding takes a different view. Rewilding takes the view that nature knows how to thrive, but what it needs is the conditions for that to happen. So what a rewilding approach does is humans begin in the first few years, you begin and you work out what's missing from the ecosystem, and you repair it, you put it back, you restore it, and then you step back. So that's the way it works. You go in, start to make a difference at the beginning, as if you were doing conservation work quite often, and then you retreat, and then nature will thrive in the way that it suits it. So it's very for people brought up in a conservation mindset, it feels odd to relinquish control, because that's what you do, and you don't know what the outcomes are going to be, and there aren't targets and goals, which is very different. One of the most important missing processes in nature is the presence of large animals that have an ecosystem engineering effect. So they create disturbance, and that can be everything from the way they eat, they browse, they graze, and they disturb the land, like the pigs here in the top right, snuffling it up. So all of these animals have wild ancestors, which would have been everywhere. So since the last ice age, and before that, they were all, many of these big animals were exterminated. So wild cattle, wild ponies still here, we still have wild boar, still have deer, but some of the bears, the wolves, the lions, the elephants, the rhinoceroses that were in England have gone. So when we have a rewilding project, they will typically bring in ecosystem engineers to create a mosaic of landscapes that the animals create. One of the questions that people always ask is, how does land change if you rewild it? Because we're not abandoning the land, because of this need to manage using animals, those that are kept domestic as if they were domestic. So we are looking at changes that we are witnessing and helping the animals to manage. So here's a actually from the Heal Somerset site. So this is quite a rewilded corner, but what you would notice would be tussocky grass, docks, bramble pillows, dead trees, lots of mixed habitats in hedges, there's some overgrown hedges in this image. And that is how land changes. And that is a mosaic habitat, because scrub is incredibly valuable. Trees are obviously really important, but those grassy areas would gradually grow over. And by having large animals, they keep the spaces open. If you go to the New Forest, that's a really good example. Reintroductions are also a feature because we've got species that have gone, and this is where conservation and rewilding are similar, but reintroduction projects could include butterflies, flowers, beavers, and even bison. So some of you may have read about the bison in Kent, but we will not see wolves, in my opinion. I'm 66, I'm never going to see a wolf in my lifetime, even if I live another 30 years. And lynx we might see in Scotland, wildcats we will see. There are pine marten reintroductions. So rewilding projects are about, the good ones are about properly run reintroductions, which can add to the richness of the species diversity. So I'll talk briefly about Heal. We launched 4 years ago in March, with a simple goal to get everyone together to do something practical about nature. And it was the idea that if we owned land at scale, which means around 200 hectares, 400 to 600 acres, that you could make a difference for nature if you own that land and manage it for nature in perpetuity. So we've been raising money to buy land for rewilding since March 2020. We'd just gone into lockdown, which was a bit tricky, but actually great because people were furloughed and we got lots of attention. So we're a registered charity, and we're active in England only. We're registered for England and Wales, active in England only, because we're not Scottish and we don't speak Welsh, and England is the place that more than anything needs the help. So we're looking at scale. So our goal, and I'd love to live to see this, is a rewilding site in every English county. So we started in Somerset, as I'll come on and say, but our goal is 10,000 hectares of degraded land. So that means land that's not in good ecological condition, restored for nature, and they will become strongholds for wildlife. So our 3 pillars are nature recovery, but also climate change action, which is what a rewilding project naturally does, is sequester carbon, and there are other benefits. And then well-being. We have promised our supporters, of which there are tens of thousands, that we will have half of our site open 50 weeks of the year, day and night, for people to come for free. So we have 8 kilometres of mown paths at our first site, and we will replicate that at all our sites. And we're talking to our local GP practice about nature-based social prescribing, which basically means walking in nature with other people, which is a really effective way of supporting people's mental health. We said we wanted to buy our first rewilding site within by the end of 2022, and we just did it with 48 hours to spare. This is the site. Our land goes right up to the trees, not the trees in the very background, but sort of towards 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. It's beautiful, heavy clay, was a dairy farm until about 7 years ago. Very dilapidated buildings, but the land has huge potential. It's got small numbers of species as a sort of base for growth. Here are some of the species that we've seen, and yesterday we saw a great white egret for the first time. Beautiful, beautiful bird. Lots of linnets starting to appear, redwing, fieldfare. So we've got this really good base of species, more than we expected, but still in small numbers. Hares, lots of hares. And we're also surrounded by people who are interested in helping nature. So it's not just about us being an island, but we're connected with people around us who are doing things for nature. There's a lovely view of our site. And we have a land sponsorship scheme, which people really like, where we ask people for a one-off donation of £20, and that actually pays for that 3 metre by 3 metre. It's called Heal 3 by 3 metre by 3 metre patch of land. And then we give people their What 3 Words address. And the scale's not quite right, because that would be a very, very large roe deer. But people come onto our sites with their What 3 Words app on their phone, and they can literally walk to where their square is, and they absolutely love that depth of connection. So let's think about what we're trying to do at our first site, and we will do at subsequent sites, and how does that translate in what you can do at the scale I mentioned. And I've done this at my home in Berkshire, where I live when I'm not on site. So what you want to think about is mimicking nature and the animals that are in it. So having wildlife in your garden is something that all of us probably are aware of, but acting like an animal would in the setting is a more unusual concept. So three in particular of the things that animals do, and in fact I guess the water's the fourth, but the first is they graze. So you could imagine a mown path as a path that could have been grazed by a cow or a pony. What that does is have different levels of habitat, short grass and long grass, so leave long grass. But and don't cut it over winter. So top right, we've got dead plants. So if you cut all your dead plants down, you're depriving insects of a home. And in nature, that wouldn't happen. So that is acting again. Animals leave dead plants alone. So that's a kind of inaction. Bottom right, bare earth. Nature doesn't like bare earth, but actually it benefits different species. So that's quite an important habitat. And that's what big animals create by rolling in the dust. They create bare earth patches, and you can do that in your garden. And water, ponds are everything. Ponds are life. Again, big animals will dig scrapes that are then filled with rainwater. So that's again a sort of disturbance thing, but you can stick in a butler sink there, any size. And don't forget, they've got the hedgehog ramp there, but life will come to that extremely quickly, and you don't always need to plant them up, but that will certainly speed things along. So and native plants, and realize that pollinators aren't just bees, pollinator and nectar plants all year round, and leaving dead wood. That's the other thing that's really important. And the most important thing is messiness, just being resisting the need to tidy is the thing that most people can do, and explain to people why they've let their front garden apparently go to seed, literally. And Jane and Rosie asked me to, as a final thing, just to give you some recommended reading. So Feral is on there, and Wilding, the NEP book about the NEP project, which was the inspiration for us. Book of Wilding is really practical. It's got a big chunk in the back of it. It's a bit of a tome, but it's got a really good chunk about small scale rewilding. A couple of Ben McDonald books and some others that are more academic, particularly the Paul Jepson book, which is absolutely excellent on large animals in the landscape. So that's us. And having our first site has been an incredibly exciting experience, and we are watching nature thrive already in front of us. And it just goes to show that when it's given help, it can bounce back. And I hope anybody watching this would love to come one day. So you book your parking, which is £3 a day, and then you can visit the site any time of the year except over Christmas. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you very much indeed. Inspiring as ever. You've run through quite a number of things, including what you're doing at Heal and what we can do on our patch. So we've got some questions already coming up. So Rosie wants to know, pigs churn things up a great deal. Do they need some sort of numbers control?
Yes. A pig kept wild, which is the term, wild kept wild, needs 60 acres. So we will not have more than 3, probably. So it'd be very small numbers. And they do churn the land up, which is good if you've got pasture land like there is at Heal. But you wouldn't have, it's not about intensive livestock. It's about small numbers living as if they're wild all year round, unless there's heavy snow or the food supply is poor, but essentially they'll be wild living. And our animals are being kept as ecosystem engineers, not as farmed produce. So they will live their lives out, and we will either have female only herds, or we will provide piglets or pony or foals or calves to other rewilding projects. That's our plan.
So do you need to control where they are and are not allowed to go?
Only that we can't yet afford to replace our perimeter fencing. So we will have to put them in electrically fenced areas at the moment. But as soon as we can afford to make sure that our perimeter fencing is secure, they can go anywhere they like. So they are literally free roaming, and they will be where people visit. So they will be mixing in with people, but with that few, the encounters will be unlikely to be many, because they won't be fed by humans. They'll be feeding themselves. So they will be as wild as we can make them.
So is that a good answer, Rosie? She's obviously muted. Okay, so Henrietta wants to know, if you're not conserving brackets restoring, does this mean that you're using the agricultural inheritance? For example, here, the underlying soil is chalk-based. Our native plants need that very poor soil if you want to bring them back. Does that make sense, Dan?
It does. And the way that we are generally preferring not to look for sites on chalk downland, because it tends to have a flora which is the result of human management of the land over many centuries. But what projects do that have chalk is use grazing animals to maintain it. So it is maintained, but that's an area of expertise that it's not one that I have. But I do know that there are some, so generally speaking, you're looking for ecologically depleted land when you're rewilding. You're not going to take something over which has an important flora base that you could lose, because there are losers and winners when you rewild, because nature is in charge. So even if you have grazing animals, browsing animals, that may not preserve something which is the result of a lot of human intervention in the land. So it's a judgment, and that's where you would go for a conservation approach, not a rewilding approach, if you had precious habitats. But most ecologically depleted habitats have been intensively farmed, often dairy or livestock. So and the chalk downland situation is certainly particular.
Henry, okay?
Yes, because although, you know, there's a big push for planting wildflowers and everything, people try and plant native wildflowers around here being where a number of people are based. It doesn't work because the soil's too rich and fertile.
Yes.
And I wasn't complaining about what you were doing. It's obviously opening up for many pollinating insects, etc. But I was just interested in the difference, and you've explained that there is.
The challenge actually here, we've got 116 species of trees and plants, but you never see them because they are one or two a long way off or on the edges. And what this place is a it's not a monoculture, but there are maybe 5 or 6 species of grasses that are really good for livestock, really nutritious. They have to be fertilized with slurry or artificial fertilizer to keep strong. And the soil currently supports flower species that like rich soil. So that is docks, nettles, thistles, and those are amazing for insects. This year we had thistles come up, which would never have come up, have been chopped down, because silage was taken on this land every few months. So the plants never got a chance to get going. So now the thistles have come out, and they were just covered in butterflies. It was amazing, and hoverflies and other pollinators. But generally the flora is poor. So we've got to wait for the fertility to drop, which could take a long time. Plus clay has a natural positive ion bond with phosphate. So if you have phosphate in your soil, it's tough to get rid of it. So we don't know what's going to happen, but we are going to have we're looking for funding to have it's called grassland reversion, and some universities are doing what's called grassland reversion, so improved pasture, reverting to poor meadow condition, but it's time as well as trying to introduce flowers as well. But we do, as I said, we do have a base of flowers, but we should have red campion everywhere. We've got one little clump, for example. So that's something we can do, particularly around the hedge edges, which are not fertilized, haven't been fertilized. And we have natural regeneration happening quickly, blackthorn particularly.
Wow. So much information. Okay, so Rosie's asking a good question, which I know a lot of people do ask. I've been asked it myself. So how can we afford to rewild land when we need to be growing food, basically?
It really depends on where you start from. So if we understand that nature is a contributor to our society in multiple ways, not least pollinators for arable crop production, it's vital, and it contributes as well to our sense of well-being. And I don't know if any of you have been in cities, often not in this country, but cities that are concrete. People, don't feel well in those places. And we obviously need food. We have imported and exported food for decades as a trading nation. I heard the other day that much of the lamb that we produce is exported, and then we import New Zealand lamb, which to me seems slightly strange. But if we follow the recommendations of the food report that was done by Henry Dimbleby, which talks about everybody consuming less meat, then the land freed up by that shift, which is already happening, there are signs of it already happening, that's the land that can be given back to nature. So it is about diets changing and the right kind of land being given back to nature. And yeah, we all need food. So we're very supportive of that. And we will grow food as well on the Heal site, which I haven't mentioned, but we will be majority for nature, but a percentage of the area for food. And other farmers will do it the other way around. But it's really important. Regenerative farming is a vital change in farming practices, which does support nature, which is also really important. And many of the people around us are doing regen farming.
And we have a speaker on regen farming in February, a chap called Regen Ben. And I made a massive faux pas when I phoned him up initially to ask him if he would talk to us, because I mentioned the word rewilding. And he said, we're not about rewilding, we actually grow food. So I do see that the working together is important, but also understanding the distinctions and the importance of each is it's a subtlety, but it's definitely important. So I had to backtrack a bit and say, I understand you're not doing rewilding.
Yes, I think what's interesting is that people who have previously owned land that they've grown food on have sold it as golf courses or for housing development or for equine use. What's interesting is that the use for nature is the one that is the more difficult or the most difficult, and that's a whole different topic. But farmers have always looked to diversify, and helping nature will give them a diversified income now, because it's the goal of government policy. And I think that's vital. I think all of us that appreciate nature would want to see it come back, and also make sure that our food system and food security is clearly important, but it's we import food. So, and we always have, and it's only, and if there was ever, we've always said that if there was ever a blockade and we had to dig for Britain, we would give our land back over to agriculture in extremis, because, and I'm sure it would be commandeered anyway to do that, but the land would be in a lot better shape than it was when it began for that purpose. So yeah.
Henry, you had your hand up a moment ago. Did you have?
Yeah, I was typing it. What I find absolutely astounding is the government is only just consulting and researching into which areas of the country would be best used for which purposes. You would really think that this is something that was well known. So which would be best for growing your food on, which would be best for growing houses, which would be best for planting woods, and presumably rewildings along with that. I studied soil science many moons ago, and I just find this sort of ignorance, if you like, which is of course a political one. I just find it absolutely incredible that nobody has worked this out before.
I think it's to do with ownership and control, because if people own land, you can't tell them what to do with it. It's like telling someone who owns a house that they have to pave over their garden, or they have to take up their paving. That is a vote-losing strategy. And a land use framework makes great sense, but how you actually make that work on the ground, you can obviously persuade people, you can incentivize people, you can inspire people to change the way they do things. But I'm really interested to see how a land use strategy or framework would actually work, because of people owning land and having a particular view about what they do with it. So, you know, we're not a country where people are told what to do, I guess.
You might choose to not put solar farms on land, or not allow planning for solar farms.
That makes sense, totally. There are enough roofs for all the solar we need.
A few little good ideas like that, would help.
That's a good one. That's a really good example.
Yes, it is a very good example.
It makes me very annoyed.
No, it should be on roofs.
So, Jan, how do you keep track of what's changing at Heal?
Great question. Everything we do is science-based and evidence-based, and we have I have a wonderful colleague, Hannah Needham, who has put together a gold standard baselining and monitoring program. What that means is what's here, what habitat is here, which trees, how many, where's the grass, where's the wet areas, and so on. And that's been done actually for us by Ecosoulis, who are a habitat an ecological consultancy. And then how's our carbon doing, which we've done, and then each of our species, so bird surveys, reptile surveys, insect surveys, and et al. Across all of the species groups. So once we've done our baselining, which will take 2 years, and the reason is when you arrive in an area, you don't know your local experts, you don't know your spider people and your badger people, and you have to get to know them. And if you arrive in January, they're all booked up for the summer. So actually we're having to go into 2024 for that reason. But then it's a matter of funding. So we would like to, and some species don't need monitoring or resurveying as often, but essentially it's at the appropriate intervals, if we have the funding, checking on the changes for those species groups. You know, what's happening at breeding birds. NEP didn't do that because they didn't know what was happening. So they're doing it by comparing it with their neighbours. But I think somebody did a study of a neighbour with dung, an organic farm with dung, and I think there were 70 dung beetles and there were 14,000 when they did the same test at NEP. It was literally unbelievable difference. So that's how we're tracking, by baselining and then checking on changes, and that's our impact essentially of the work that we do.
So that'll be really exciting when you're
exciting.
5 or 6 years in, when you can see all the stats on a graph to say how many more of this type of bird or that type of insect you've got. That'd be terrific.
And what is really astonishing is this is month 11, and we asked somebody who is 3 years ahead in Derbyshire what would happen, and she said your birds of prey will increase. Because as soon as you let your grass grow long, because it's a non-intervention year this year while we baseline, your prey base will go up. Your mice, your wood mice, your voles, your shrews, they'll all rocket in number because they have multiple litters a year and they can all hide. And we've got holes everywhere, and there are barn owls out now, tawny's out. We saw a short-eared owl today, we're pretty sure. And kestrels are now breeding this year on the site, though we don't know if they were breeding last year because there was no survey done. But the birds of prey are already responding, we think, to the prey base. It's anecdotal, but that is, to be here and see those birds of prey every day is a change from January or February. It's really interesting.
It's fascinating. I personally find that, you know, what you say makes perfect sense. Of course, there are more voles and mice and stuff, but actually to see it happen must be just amazing, even if it makes sense that it should.
Grass growing long is it's grass that's not being eaten by livestock or taken for silage, grows long, flops over, which is not great, but it's what we've got. And the little animals love it, the little mammals love it, poor things.
What were the
Can
first?
I suggest, Jane, I think Alan's question and my question are on the same lines. So if I may, I'll put the two together.
All right, you
We're
put the two together then.
We're interested. You talked about doing some early stage interventions and repair interventions. I've called them helper activities. And we were interested in what have you done to get things started in the repair sense in Somerset, and what's the balance between implementing some of these things and knowing when to step back and let it go?
So the answer on the repairing in Somerset is we haven't yet, because we're baselining. So in order to get an accurate baseline, you need to do nothing. And then you are genuinely comparing what effect the intervention has had in the latter part of next year and beyond. The only intervention we've made is mowing 8 kilometers of paths, and we didn't really think about it at the time, but of course I'm a business person, I'm not from an ecology background, and you're creating an alternative habitat. You're doing a mowing job a grazing job by mowing, and all the little animals have used it. The foxes use it, the badgers use it, the deer use them. So we intervened, but for good reason. So when we do intervene, we will we are at the heart of the Forest of Selwood. And the Forest of Selwood was like the New Forest. It was a 14,000 acre forest stretching from Wiltshire right into Somerset. And it was where the Vikings were stopped at this forest, and it was a hunting forest, and it was sold off in the 14th, 15th century. And Selwood means sallow wood. It's so wet here that the landscape should be covered in willows, and there are hardly any. So planting willows is high on our list, because we believe those should be here. And re-wetting the fields is on our list. So the fields are drained. They should be naturally much wetter than they are. So there used to be curlew here. They've gone. We had 6 snipe this year, which are fantastic. But curlew should be here. Whether they come back or not, I don't know. So it'll be breaking up the land drains and blocking up the drainage ditches, which are human interventions that we're reversing. And then reconnecting the floodplain. We have 3 tributaries of a river. So a lot of rewilding projects do this. They reprofile their rivers for natural flood management. So you're contributing to downstream flooding problems by holding the flow of water back through human-made interventions, including what our guy calls rubbish beaver dams. You can actually put these sort of leaky dams in the rivers just to hold back the flow. But we have wild living beavers just up the road, so they should turn up, which would be very exciting. So planting some trees. We're not a tree planting charity, but we are looking at tree planting because they should be here. So that's a repairing move. Wildflowers, possibly butterflies that have lost their food plants. Duke of Burgundy used to be in Somerset, for example, which has gone. Rivers, ponds, restoring ponds. There used to be 4 ponds that have gone, natural ponds that have been filled in. Yeah, they're most of the interventions on this site, but it would be different. And then the other thing is, how do you know when to stop? Nobody knows. It's a judgment. And part of the learning of these sites is keeping that balance. And NEP have struggled with their livestock numbers, because if you have too many, they knock back they create too big a grass area. If you have too few, you get overgrowth of brambles and blackthorn saplings and so on. So it's an unknown quantity because every place is different, and it depends on the years as well. If we have lots of drought years, that would be really different from if we have wet summers. So it's a suck it and see, essentially, but while maintaining this idea of a balance. So the idea is not overgrowth of scrub plants, but having a balance of scrub plants. So blackthorn, hawthorn, wild rose, a bramble, and grass areas, and regenerating woodland. And just to mention, we had 6 volunteers come for 2 hours. They walked a few fields, looking at 5-meter strips, and they found 110 baby oak trees of this sort of height. So they've been chopped off in previous years, and they're now everywhere. So we've got an oak forest coming back already, and we have now counted those. So we're going to repeat that in May next year to see if the deer that we have eaten them or not over the winter. And then if there are issues with too many deer, our neighbours who are farming, many of them have offered to cull them. We'd rather not cull them, but they have no predator. So that's another question of intervening, would be deer numbers potentially.
So there's plenty of work for volunteers to do there then.
Lots of, in fact, the one of the ideas we like novel ideas. Am I all right for time? I'm chatting. I don't want to take up too much time. It's 20 past.
We've got another 10 minutes.
Okay.
And there are a few more questions.
Okay, I won't talk about the oak counting, but yes, we'll be repeating that in May and doing more, I would think. So yeah.
Okay, so this is Trevor from the Natural History Society. 1 annual cut and collect. We have modified our working over time. Our areas are too small to use grazing animals. So
Yep.
is your question, Trevor, sort of checking that this makes sense? You're muted.
You're muted, Trevor.
You're muted. I can't hear either.
There he is.
Right,
Thank you.
okay.
So it was really just to say what our experience has actually been very briefly. You know, we all talked initially about this idea of this one cut in the vegetation once a year in September time and removing all the cuttings off the site to reduce
Fertility,
the sort of fertility in the soil. But actually, it's not really worked very well on our site. We've still got far too much coarse grass on the site. And but we have modified what we were doing over the period of, well, it's now 10, it's about 14 years since we first started. But so instead of cutting the whole area in September, we chopped it into thirds. So we left the standing flowers and that flower heads on a third of it 1 year, or for 2 years really, and then we just cut 1/3 of it and collected that vegetation. Then we rotated which third got managed that way. Really,
That's exactly the advice we've had. That's exactly the advice from a rewilding specialist.
Yeah,
we've had. Third, a third, a third.
Yeah. So we kind of evolved that ourselves, really, which I think is good.
Because
And,
the long
the
grass
other-
is shelter, and it's homes for insect eggs and
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, we've got a very healthy slowworm population on our plot, and I think slowworms are actually everywhere. It's just that people don't go out looking for them, and just by putting slowworm mats down, it does attract slowworms. And you know, I wish more people actually did that. I think. The one other comment I did want to make was just about regenerative farming. If people have never been to a regenerative farm open day, I definitely advise them to go.
Okay,
We've
we're
got
going to hear
farm
about
plus.
that in February, so come along.
Yeah,
to that
I
talk too.
appreciate that, but you just be astounded at what they're actually achieving. I mean, we've got a farm cluster near here, 5 miles away, and everything is integrated. There's no suggestion of just strips around the outside of the field for biodiversity. It's all integrated into the crops. So yeah, I won't mention any more now anyway, but
No, because we've got a special evening for that, and we've got a couple more
yeah,
questions.
yeah.
So Alan is asking, why is farmland with animals more depleted than arable farmland? What about the impact of pesticides and chemicals? Does that make sense, that question?
It does. It's not that it's all, well, so I can't say it's all equally depleted, but unless it's been regeneratively farmed, the depletion both of the soil health and the presence of wildlife is common across both farming systems, but the depletion on pasture land can be tackled because it's deemed most suitable for rewilding, and the arable farms, unless they are regeneratively farmed, will carry on being depleted. So it's depleted on across the piece, but it's the depletion that we can fix on pasture land because it's affordable, generally speaking, for people to buy for nature, and arable land is rightly kept for food production.
Okay, thank you. And then the next question, Rosie's last question I can answer. I'm sure you're getting a growing number of people wanting to know more, to see your site. What has been your biggest surprise in this respect?
People wanting to know more and wanting to see the site. Biggest surprise. Well, I think the biggest surprise was less about the site, but more about when we first launched, because we set up volunteering for 12 people in March 2020, and we had 170 people volunteer in 3 weeks. So that was a huge surprise. I think what's been so great about people arriving and being interested in what we do is how open-minded they are, and also accepting that this takes time, it's a journey, not being impatient, enjoying what there is, and also noticing the small things, because quite often it's fine to go to the Kent project and see a bison behind a very big fence, but it's actually, nature is all about lots and lots of really small important things, the lichen, the tiny fungi, the insect life, and people just seem to appreciate, from all walks of life, just seem to really appreciate nature, and it's just lovely to be with other people. I'm not sure that's a surprise, but the big surprise that we give them is we say blackthorn can be this long, that's a pen, so long as a pen. Which animal was that thorn developed to defend against? And when we tell them it was elephants and rhinoceroses, that's the moment their jaws drop, because what we're seeing is the evidence the land tells us of what was once here that's gone, and we'll never get those things back. But yeah, it's amazing. So I don't know if that answers your question, Rosie, but that's my best go.
Oh, that's very helpful.
And do you have another site lined up elsewhere yet?
No, we know where it's going to be, in that it'll be in the north of England. So we're looking at the northern counties, so Yorkshire, Lancashire, Northumberland, because we want to be balanced, so north and south. But we want to settle this site first. We want to make sure that we know what we're doing as a team. We've gone from a team of 2.5 to 8 now. That's quite quick growth, but it's going really well. We want to get everything right here, learn for the first couple of years, and then start looking mid-year next year. So it's obviously funding related, but Heal North is good, and then we think it'll snowball. So once we get the second site, because of the changes in business funding for nature and government funding for nature, we think there'll be a snowball and we'll acquire more quickly. So perhaps one site within the next 2 years, and then possibly 2 or 3 sites within the following 2 years, and so on. So really speed things up for scale.
I really hope so. Thank you, Jan. Thank you so much. And